Hello and welcome to the Chorilosophy Podcast, a weekly podcast whose mission is multifaceted. Each week when you tune in, you will find episodes that question best practices, challenge music education dogma, facilitate conversations about touchy topics, demonstrate pedagogies, and conversations where colleagues learn from each other. This is episode 227, The Age of Fine Arts Icons is Over, with Samuel Andreyev. The classical or concert music tradition has historically relied on a nobility or an institution for funding. This is a challenge in our modern world that has seen such a massive boom of popular and commercial genres that reject this model. So where does this leave us today? I sit down with Samuel Andreyev, a brilliant composer, educator, YouTube and podcast host, and one of the most insightful voices on the state of music and the arts today. We're diving headfirst into a big question. Has American pop music, jazz, blues, rock, and film scores overshadowed classical concert traditions so much that icons like Leonard Bernstein could never emerge again? Samuel and I explore how the overwhelming dominance of pop culture has made it harder than ever for classical music to capture mainstream attention in the US and in other countries, leaving it to fight for survival in niche spaces. But that's just the beginning. Samuel shares his fascinating journey from studying at the Paris Conservatory to becoming a French citizen and a digital content creator, where his unique insights now inspire students and composers around the world. We talk about the internet's double-edged sword, how it creates opportunities for artists but also floods the market with distractions, making it harder than ever to stand out. We tackle some big challenges of music education, including how to keep classical music relevant, and why today's musicians need to be as entrepreneurial as they are talented, and the dangers of relying too much on outdated institutions or academic pathways. Tune in and have your thinking stimulated and challenged. This one will do that a lot. Then weigh in yourself with your related ideas and experiences over on Facebook in the Chorilosophers group or on Substack at chorilosophy.substack.com. Ludus, the platform trusted by thousands of organizers to power their event ticketing, marketing, and fundraising, has just upped its game with an incredible new feature, volunteer management. Now you can streamline your volunteer coordination like never before. Volunteers can easily sign up for opportunities and shifts online while you effortlessly approve sign-ups, track hours, and manage your volunteer team. Say goodbye to volunteer management headaches and hello to seamless coordination with Ludus. Try it at ludus.com/chorilosophy and revolutionize your events. We all love to travel with our students, but we definitely don't love planning a trip. I know I've been there as the point person for details, and it is a nightmare. Forms, payments, fundraising, it's a never-ending task that takes away from doing what we love. That's where Kaleidoscope Adventures comes in. They've been planning performance trips for more than 30 years and handle all the details from start to finish. And one of the best parts about Kaleidoscope, they have crowdfunding options for every traveler. Contact Kaleidoscope Adventures at mykatrip.com to find out how they can take your travel beyond expectations. Nearly 200 people voluntarily chip in every month to make sure that the costs for this show are underwritten. But, of course, it's also an exchange. When you sign up for Patreon or paid Substack memberships, either one, you will get access to my Google folder full of goodies, presentation slides from any presentation that I've done over the last several years. It also has rubrics that I have created for class, for grading episodes, supplemental materials, repertoire lists, so you'll have access to that. Plus, of course, there is the private podcast feed, which you can hear once a month, so you can go to patreon.com/chorilosophy to sign up there for as little as $3 a month, or you can just upgrade your free Substack subscription to a paid Substack subscription. Either way, the money goes to the same place for the same purpose. The producers and inner circle at Patreon are Venture Studios, Brian Long, Angie Schilling, Danelle Eckert, David Kowalczyk, Kyle Peterson, Max Jackson, Michael Herron, and Steve and Kathy Kakacek. Okay, everybody, I am here with Samuel Andreyev, who is a composer, originally Canadian, and also the host of a fantastic YouTube channel that I very recently discovered that bears his name, Samuel Andreyev on YouTube, where he discusses all kinds of aspects of music and the arts, etc. And since that is also, in many ways, what this show is about, I decided to invite Samuel here to compare notes on some of our beliefs about music and art and why it's valuable and why it should be advocated for in society. So Samuel, welcome.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the invitation.
This will be lots of fun. Why don't you first start out by just sharing with folks who you are, what you do kind of on a day-to-day basis in your work.
I'm a composer, and that is my primary background. I studied music composition at the Paris Conservatory. I was born in Canada. I'm now a French citizen. I've been living in France for over 20 years now, nearly 25 years. And so my main thing is music composition, although I also have a YouTube channel, as you mentioned, and I teach privately. The YouTube channel was started in 2016 as a reaction to my then current teaching position. I had a job teaching music analysis in the north of France, and I found that I was amassing all of this specialized knowledge about different areas of music repertoire. I was working with my students on partly on the classical repertoire, but also on contemporary pieces, and we were sort of flipping back and forth between the two. And I was doing an enormous amount of work on that and sort of finding my feet as a professor, as a teacher, learning how to work with a range of different people in different circumstances, and just thinking it would be amazing if I could share this knowledge and this experience with a broader number of people. So YouTube at the time was sort of just starting to tap into its potential as a medium for education and mass communication. And I knew a few people who were starting to do that, who were, university professors who were putting their lectures online and things like this. And at that time, it was by no means clear to me. It never even occurred to me actually that this would be something that could, allow me to make my living. That wasn't how I was looking at it, but it looked like a powerful tool for communication. So I decided to start the channel, and simply, it was very crude at first, just very basic, just basically me improvising in front of a camera, on a given subject as though I were teaching in a classroom setting. So the first videos on my channel are ridiculously rudimentary. They're not edited. They're not, it's just one take, and I would just go for 40 minutes about a topic. And they started getting views, lots and lots of views, thousands of views, tens of thousands of views, and that really surprised me. And it actually completely upended my whole career in a sense, because from that point on, it wasn't overnight, but gradually it became clear that this was something with an enormous amount of potential. And so I gradually developed the channel, and then that had huge consequences for other areas of my professional life, including my teaching practice, which is now almost exclusively online. I've got so many demands for private lessons as a result of the exposure that my YouTube channel gets, and so I've been able to set up a life that involves composing, teaching online, making YouTube videos, and then of course pursuing my normal freelance composition projects. So that's where I am today.
That's fascinating. Now, when you teach, do you primarily teach composition students or players?
It's almost exclusively composers. Some of them want to work on composition exclusively. Some of them want analysis lessons. Some of them want a mix of the two. Occasionally, I'll get students that want to work on their knowledge of music history. But for the most part, it's creative people who are making music in a variety of different ways. Most of them are still writing conventional scores, pieces that are intended to be played in concert. A lot of them are making electronic music or various other formats that they're working in. So it's fascinating work. I mean, it's an amazingly excellent job to have, because every single student that comes to work with me is highly motivated. They generally know precisely what they want to do and where they need to make progress. And it's a total joy to be able to accompany them in that and to help them reach their goals. And they're all incredibly interesting people making really distinctive work. And it's just so much fun to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating. There's certain parallels I've discovered in my life. My show is very much not optimized for YouTube. It's 95% of the people who hear this conversation will be hearing audio only. But I do put stuff on YouTube just because, it's free to put it on there. But it's a very interesting thing where on my side of the experience 6 years ago, putting conversations online without really a goal in mind to do anything with it. And then suddenly more and more people start finding it. It's just an amazing time to be alive in terms of information and conversation.
Oh, it definitely is. I gave a speech to that effect about a year ago in London at a conference called ARC, ARC, and your viewers can find that if they want to hear it. But basically, the crux of it was that there has never been a time in history where it's been more advantageous to be an artist. I mean, the conditions that you or I have to work in today are they would have been science fiction even 20 years ago. Like,
Right.
and the possibilities that opens up for creative people are immense. So that's not to say that it's necessarily always easy, because of course, anytime you're a freelance artist trying to make a living, trying to make a name for yourself, it's challenging. One of the new challenges that has arisen as a result of this increasing tendency for people to work on laptops is that, of course, there are no gatekeepers anymore, at least not to the same extent as might have been the case in the past. So the internet is a flood of information that is extremely difficult to wade through, and there are no, we don't really have these we don't really have these gatekeepers anymore. These highly influential, well-funded record labels and all the rest of the arts infrastructure that used to keep a relatively small number of artists afloat, but also kept out a large number of people that weren't able to access those structures for one reason or another.
Yeah.
So it can be hugely beneficial for people who are extraordinarily motivated and hardworking, and who are able to structure their time incredibly well. Then there are lots of opportunities, but you also have to contend with the fact that there's a sea of noise, and so it's harder to make your voice heard than it might have been the case in the past.
That's for sure. Now, I would say, and I don't think it's necessarily a disagreement with what you just said, it's more like just an addendum, which is that, yes, you're right, there are less gatekeepers, or it's harder to keep the gate, is maybe how I would say it. There's an
Right.
because of that onslaught of information, although there are still people who will try. And I would put into that category academics, and I would put into that category professional organizations, institutions who would still love to be the gatekeepers. Is that something you ever see?
Oh yeah, absolutely. But it's kind of laughable now because they don't look. If you're a young composer now who's thinking of getting into academia and perhaps doing a master's degree or a doctoral degree in composition, it's like you can do that, and the process of going through that program might give you some useful professional contacts, and the process of having to frame your work as research might have some ancillary benefits. But the idea that you're going to then be able to access a job market is, unfortunately, it's not a reality anymore. Or it's not a reality for the vast majority of people doing these programs. It's not a job path. And I try to make that very clear with the students that I'm working with. It's like you can go to an Ivy League school and get a doctorate in composition, but 10,000 other people are doing that too, and there are no positions. So it's like it doesn't actually make things any easier for you in the long run.
Yeah.
So in all likelihood, you're still going to have to create your own professional pathway, and that can mean any number of different things, right? For some composers, it might mean starting their own ensemble or performing their own work themselves, or they might exclusively make electronic music and just sidestep the whole question of performance altogether. They might get into making video game music or animation music or film music, whatever. Like they might end up making YouTube videos, or they might go the traditional path and continue to write scores and try to get commissions. But there are far more possibilities open to composers now than was the case 50 years ago. And
Yeah.
if you're the entrepreneurial type, and if you have marketing skills, which is such a dirty word for a lot of people, but it's like, if you have no ability to communicate or to get people interested in what you're doing, and you want to do something esoteric, then you're in for a rough ride, because the institutions are not as powerful as they used to be, and they won't be able to support you in a way that they might have been able to do in the 1960s or 70s.
Yeah, I've got an idea about what you just said, and I want to see what you think about it, especially because your perspective being a non-American, I want to make sure that this is just something that I'm not seeing as an American. And
Sure.
that is that I feel like as classically trained musicians, which is what a side note, one of the things I love about your channel is that it's clear that you're a classically trained musician, but you don't discriminate, so to speak. You're talking about all kinds of music and rock and pop and other types of things, which I think is a really good sign because, as musicians, that is something that we should take as a matter of pride. But the thing that I notice is that I feel like in classical musician, academic music, which is primarily where classical music resides in a lot of ways around the world right now, we still are in love with a shadow of our former selves, so to speak, where classical music was raised in Europe at a time when we were supported, we meaning classical musicians, were supported by the institutions, namely the feudalist system, and you were supported by a patron, and it was almost as if to be legitimate, to be considered legitimate within the classical world, an institution had to sprinkle legitimacy upon you. And that was, and I almost see shadows of that still today, where to your point, if you have marketing skills, almost like that's a dirty word. We don't want to see classical musicians that market themselves. We want to see them bestowed by an organization with a gig or with a presentation, or that almost confers more legitimacy within a lot of these ecosystems than to simply say create a YouTube channel or go straight to the audience with the music without those gates. Are you picking up what I'm putting down, or is this crazy?
Well, it confers a certain legitimacy, but only within a very small circle, and it's a circle that has a dwindling amount of authority. That's the
Right.
problem.
Hmm.
So this is not it's not an interesting prospect. It's like yes, like your 15 most illustrious colleagues will perhaps, if you're able to succeed, perhaps they'll let you into the circle, but it doesn't extend. The circle of concern doesn't extend any farther out than that. And
Hmm.
that's a huge issue as far as I'm
Hmm.
concerned.
Hmm.
And it's a huge issue, not least because it's damaging to the art form itself. Like it needs oxygen. It needs contact with the outside world. And this idea that you can exist within a completely disconnected bubble, I find that, well, for me personally, it's a horrible idea. I would be deeply unsatisfied if I thought that my life's work, was confined to such a tiny circle.
Yeah.
So no, I absolutely understand that. I think that what we're seeing now and what we're likely to see in the future is actually a reversion to the patronage system that was the predominant model in the throughout the 18th century and beyond. Uh, the situation that we have currently is to a large extent, not exclusively, but very largely, a result of the two world wars and the situation that resulted in Europe. When Germany and France and the other European countries were rebuilding after World War II, one of the ways that they sought to do that and to assert their modernity and their existence as progressive nation states was by showing off the modernity of the culture that they were producing. And that was very clearly the case in Germany, for example, where there was a sudden turn towards a kind of radical avant-garde tendency in art music, which is unmistakable in the years following the Second World War.
Hmm.
And because of the sort of inherently non-commercial nature of a lot of that work, it was able to exist because of the heavy state subsidization that followed. And there were some benefits to that, absolutely. So one of the things that resulted from that was there was a generation of young German composers, and this was, to a degree, it was also the case in France, although it happened a little bit later there. There was a generation of young German composers that had unparalleled access to extraordinarily luxurious professional conditions. And at least in principle, a wide open field of aesthetic possibilities, because the need to make a living was removed for them. And for a while, that did actually result in some extraordinary things being done. There was a kind of excitement in the air. There was a sort of utopian idea that you could You could invent entirely new musical grammars, and you could just explore the new aesthetic and technological possibilities that were open to composers. The problem is that and this happened in the United States as well to a degree. The music became increasingly entrenched in these sort of academic pockets, with increasingly sort of circular and restricted and highly specialized audiences that were interested in it. And it became increasingly dependent also on this kind of massive state subsidization. And if you look at the history of opera, of symphonic music, of chamber music throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, you see that they were never divorced from commercial concerns. The idea that artists were able to somehow just sit and write whatever they wanted to write straight from the heart without any constraints is a total fallacy. It was never like that. Artists have always had to contend with commercial pressures. They've always had to contend with the fact that they are, like it or not, they exist in a marketplace, and they've got colleagues who are also writing music, and an audience that may be fickle and that may be more or less interested in what they're doing. And composers have always had to contend with commercial pressures, especially in sort of public forums like opera and symphonic music, which are inherently expensive and inherently subject to intense commercial pressures. So this post-war heavily subsidized situation created this idea that you could be delivered from that, right? You could be saved from having to compete in a commercial marketplace, and you could sort of you could pursue your own idiosyncratic personal aesthetic ends without having to worry about any of that. And
you could write music. Sorry to interrupt. I was going to say you could write. Just going to say it another way. You could write music without having to care if people like it.
Yes, that's another way of putting it, and that is very much true. And look, a lot of this was done with the idea that, well, they don't like it now, partly because it's very new, it's extremely novel, and it's demanding, and it's advanced, right? So A, it's going to attract, by its very nature, a relatively small number of people, and B, it's going to take time for the larger audience to come around. And I'm receptive to that argument to a degree, but you can only defer that for so long, right? And especially when it comes to extremely expensive art forms that have to be paid for somehow. And if they're paid out of the public pocket, and this goes on decade after decade, and the artists aren't making every concerted effort to make a strong case for their work publicly, but they become sort of entitled, they become sort of just expecting that they're going to keep getting these subsidies, then it's not healthy for the art form.
The list of resources that this podcast has generated around it continues to grow. You can, of course, for free, go use the Vocal Pedagogy Suite or the Music Literacy Suite anytime you'd like. Those are sub-pages on my website that keep all of those episodes on those two topics organized. So if you are ever wanting to do a deep dive on teaching your kids to read music or sing well, kind of like our main job, you can go there to the website and find those. Quick Google search also will help you find those. And of course, the list of discounts on incredibly helpful products for music educators is also substantial. You can go to 3minutetheory.com and get 15% off with the promo code there. And of course, Sight Reading Factory. Every time you renew your membership for yourself and your student memberships, you can knock 10% off every time you do checkout there. SightReadingFactory.com, which is a huge benefit to you because it's the best program out there, but also you get a discount, and all of those promo code uses help support this show as well. Yeah, that's really well put and well summarized. And I think in some ways, some of the challenges that we now face with arts education, which is something I'd really like to get into here because most of my audience are music educators, is that we as music educators we're trained in the history of all the things that you just talked about, and we're taught to learn about the post-war German composers and the composers of the 19th century and 18th century and 17th century, and we have this whole music history curriculum that we're all taught. However, we then have to go outside of the bubble of academia, especially in places that teach music within public or state school settings, like in the U.S. and many other countries. I teach the kids who are in my zip code. I teach the kids who are in my postal area, right? So I do have to interact with the outside of the bubble and make music relevant to those kids. And I think in a lot of ways that informs my perspective on a lot of things, where I might have learned about this a type of music that I fell in love with when I was an undergraduate. But then having that conversation with a 14-year-old whose only frame of reference is Taylor Swift it becomes my challenge as an educator. So if I were to say to you, and let's say I like to do this experiment with lots of guests, where let's say you're sitting down at a bar in an airport, and somebody sits down next to you and says, "Hey, what do you do?" And you say, "I write music." And then they almost inevitably may say, "Well, what kind of music?" Or maybe they even say, "Why do you do that?" Et cetera. What would be your description to an outside of the bubble person about what you do? What is music in the first place, and why do you do it?
Well, my answer to that question is usually something along the lines that I write for orchestras and choruses and soloists and chamber ensembles, and that there are different groups around the world that commission pieces from me. That's my answer. I don't usually get into describing the style of it, not because I'm shy about doing that to non-specialist listeners, but because I just don't do that generally very much. I'm probably the least equipped person to get into descriptions of my own work. I find that actually quite embarrassing, and I prefer to leave it up to other people.
Interesting.
So, there's an irony there, because a big part of how I interface with the public is that I have a YouTube channel and I'm constantly talking about other people's work, which I'm happy to do. But I'm very reticent to do that about my own work. So, and I don't feel equipped to do it. So I don't get into stylistic questions so much, but I'll tell them what sort of ensembles I write for. And then they often have questions about, how that works, and, how do they find you, and how do you get the commissions, and so on. And you can have a discussion about that. So, but yeah, I wouldn't get into aesthetics.
Okay, that's fine. I have a broader question for you now. What is music?
Well, that's a complicated question. Music. Well, there's a quote by the Italian composer Luciano Berio, who says that music is whatever you listen to with the intention of listening to music. And I suppose that's a decent enough working definition. Other people will say that music is a matter of organized sounds, which is a little bit vague. But I think that works as well to a degree, although organized sounds, the problem with that is that sounds incorporates pitched sounds, and it incorporates noises, and it incorporates conversation, and really anything. So you can debate what the frontiers are between those two things. But I think that music is hard to pin down, because it's a multi-dimensional art form. There are so many aspects to it. So music has an entertainment dimension to it. There's a lot of music that is made for the express purpose of entertaining the audience. There's music that is made in more of a spirit of research or scientific inquiry, especially in the medieval era. Music was an object of scientific and philosophical inquiry, so it had that dimension to it as well. Music can be made for strictly commercial purposes, or it can be highly individual and highly subjective. It's a very, very big field, and so it's tricky to define it. And I don't know that I would necessarily choose to do so myself. You've noticed that all of the definitions I've come up with are actually quotations from other people.
Right. Yeah, no, I'm sure. I don't really anticipate either of us would be able to come up with something completely original on the topic. I do, because for all the reasons you just listed, I do like the idea of music being constrained within sound organized over time, because I also like that like visual art, for example, that creates a nice parallel with visual art, which could be described as light organized across space. And I like how there's a symmetry there. And I don't know if I can come up with any examples of music that doesn't organize sound across a time dimension, and so I feel like it's an okay definition. Thoughts?
I think that's right. Yeah, I think it's likely a bell curve with steeply sloping sides on either end, right? And so the vast majority of music are organized sounds that unfold over time, for
Hmm.
sure. And which implies also that music is something dynamic, and it has to do with patterns and patterns that change over time. And my sense is that that is, for the vast majority of people, an indispensable component of what constitutes music. So if something is completely static, if it has no audible change or audible uh, principle of movement in it, then it's I think it's very difficult for people to hear it as music. For most people,
Yeah.
there are always going to be a very small number of people, again, on the far end of the bell curve distribution, that are going to not be satisfied with that definition. But I think it holds for most things.
Right. Yeah. Have you ever seen a YouTube video called, it was a TED Talk called The World's Ugliest Music?
No, I've not seen that one.
Oh yeah,
It's
you should,
promising
and
though.
yeah, you should check it out. Check it out, and listeners should check it out too. It actually has to do with the history of the sonar array and the math that they had to do in order to create the sonar array of pings, so that no mathematical pattern would occur. That's how they're able to tell where stuff is from, like the reflection of the sound. It's a pretty fascinating video, and then at the end of the TED Talk, somebody has actually notated the music, the quote unquote music of the sonar array, to be completely devoid of any mathematical pattern, and then they try to play it on the piano, and it's pretty funny. It's a really interesting YouTube video, but I don't want to divert our conversation. It's just throwing that out there. Okay, I want to jump into arts education a little bit because. Of course, again, like I said, that's my world and most of our audience here. But we face a lot of challenges in the arts, and I've heard you talk in other conversations about something that I found really, really interesting, which is that typically when we speak as arts educators, fine arts educators, music educators, we are, yes, engaging students with a diverse range of music from a variety of different cultures and time periods and societies and traditions and different reasons for people make music. But in a lot of ways, it's also it's considered to be a fine art, in that you aren't just listening to the music in the background, you are making the music in most, school settings. And so I've heard you talk about the lack of mainstream cultural fine arts giants. And that really resonated with me when I've heard you talk about that, because I also see that as a challenge in teaching kids about the value of approaching music in this concept of a fine art. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on that, and some of the things that you've noticed?
It's a fascinating question. It is tricky. There's a few reasons for that. So, if we're speaking specifically about the American context, one of the issues, I think, and I'm not American, I'm Canadian born, but I've spent a fair bit of time in the United States. So, one of the things I've observed, and which would be obvious to anybody who's even remotely paying attention, is that America has produced the most extraordinary array of popular and commercial music on the planet by
Mm-hmm.
far. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's no other country that can compete on that level. America invented the blues, jazz, pop, rock. I mean, all of these things that have spread to every corner of the globe. And not only that, well, in film music as well. I mean, they've developed this extraordinary film music industry, and not only that, but it's often at the very highest level of innovation in terms of new sounds and new approaches to making music, new production techniques, and just extraordinarily talented songwriters and performers that have now been now stretches into over a century of popular music traditions, and that presence is so colossal and it's so impressive that it's very difficult for the sort of European concert music tradition to get much of a foothold in that situation, right? Because there's this massive, 2,000-pound elephant in the room that that is just extraordinarily impressive, right? And then the classical music tradition, or the sort of concert music tradition, which depends on, has depended historically on a nobility in order to fund it. That's diametrically opposed to the way that American culture organizes itself. So it's not a good fit in a certain sense. Now there have been periods in which classical music has absolutely flourished in the United States, and you had hugely charismatic figures like Leonard Bernstein,
Hmm.
amongst many others, or Leopold Stokowski, or Eugene Ormandy in Philadelphia. These sort of giant figures who managed to galvanize public attention and were hugely charismatic and talented. Um, but I think that's definitely on the wane as a cultural force. So where does that leave American kids today? I think that the first thing I would say is, you have to take them where they are, and
Yep.
you have to be interested in and open to the things that they're hearing. And you really have to cultivate an interest in that. And it's like a lot of these things, when you actually start listening to them carefully, turn out to be extraordinarily interesting. So so that's the first thing. You have to tread carefully. I would never try to impose something else on kids who had no interest in that. Right? There has to be on some level an interest, an openness, a curiosity, in order to expand somebody's musical horizons.
Yeah.
Uh, so it's tricky. And as an educator, I think one of the things you can do is just to say, you know, there are these other worlds that exist that are open to you, and here are some things that you might find interesting, and you can show those to them and see how they react. Uh, but that might be all you can do.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that. And I think as a teacher, I've found over the years that depends, my success in opening up these other worlds to kids depends on also my own enthusiasm for those other worlds. If I'm acting bored, for example, about the music they enjoy, they are also less likely to not react with boredom when I describe mine. So there's a little bit of reciprocity there. But I'm also glad that you brought up Bernstein as an example of these cultural giants. Do you, because there was a movie that came out recently, that famously about him, and had a lot of music people talking about the way that movie went, and kind of some of the things that it left out, because it was mostly focused on his personal life, and it didn't spend as much time talking about the cultural impact that he had on Americans at that time. Now, of course, this is just an opinion question for you. I don't expect you to give something like a scholarly citation here, but do you think there could ever be, in an American or European context, another Bernstein type figure in the classical music world that would get that kind of attention?
It's possible, but I think it's very unlikely. I think that if, such a figure would look very, very, very different going forward, and that's what you would expect because the world is changing radically. I mean, that's kind of a statement of the obvious, but our societies are transforming at such incredible speed, and in such unpredictable ways that it would be a fool's errand to try to predict what things are going to look like next year, let alone in 20 years. Um, the technologies that are starting to blossom now, such as the large language models and ChatGPT and all of these associated technologies, are so powerful and they're advancing so rapidly that um, all bets are off, I think, and they really do change the landscape. And one of the things that I've observed is that there was a time where you could have these cultural giants. You could have these people that would dominate a field. You could have, a figure like Stravinsky, who was widely considered, perhaps along with Schoenberg, although Schoenberg is a more, uh, he was always a more sort of marginal figure relative to the broader culture than Stravinsky. But you could have these figures who were household names across the culture from top to bottom. Like everybody had at least heard the name.
Right.
You had things like Fantasia coming out, and it's like it's a cross social phenomenon, right? So the cab driver in Boston has heard of Stravinsky, and the Oxford intellectual has heard of Stravinsky. It's like everybody kind of knows who this guy is. And that was also the case in the popular music world. I mean, every single person knew who Michael Jackson was, for example. Like you have these figures that cut across everything.
Hmm.
And what I'm seeing increasingly is that all music is now a minority taste. Like it's very difficult to find examples of artists anywhere in the classical or even the popular fields where you can say that they have an impact across the entire culture. There are names that people will have heard of, like Taylor Swift, for example, or Beyonce, but do they have the same cultural impact as the Beatles had or Michael Jackson in their time? And I think the answer is likely to be no. Not necessarily because they're less talented. There's no reason at all to imagine that there's less talent today than there was 50 years ago. In fact, I think probably the opposite is true. I think we're probably getting smarter as a species, although some would probably dispute that claim. There's certainly a larger talent pool to draw upon than was the case certainly in the post-war era, because everybody was dead then. It's like everybody had been killed, so it's like there are just more people around who are well-fed and who are educated than was the case in the past. So the talent pool is certainly larger, but the way that cultural goods are disseminated has just changed so dramatically. And also the fact that we don't really have strong, powerful, centralized institutions in the way that we used to. And the fact that anybody can be their own publisher now with the rise of social media. So I think the conditions for that to happen just don't exist anymore.
Right. No, I would agree with that, and I would add to what you said too, just by giving an example of Queen. When Queen played the Live Aid show in 1985, famously, it was televised, and estimates are somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.8 billion people watched that live broadcast of Queen playing on stage in front of a gigantic crowd at a time when there was only 4 billion people on the planet. So almost half of the people that exist tuned in to watch Queen all at the same time. There is nothing even Taylor Swift doesn't come close to that type of cultural cachet that would have been possible back then. And I almost feel like for a classical artist to get to even Bernstein level relevance, cultural relevance, maybe would be how I would say that, would require a whole bunch of conditions to happen that I don't know would be possible. So I'm going to float this at you and see what you think. I think it would take a very tech-savvy, very virtuosically high-quality musician who also has the support of the institutions and gatekeepers and is willing to go straight to the audience and create something that is, maybe we would recognize as fine art, but be able to package it as popular art. And I just think that the skill set that would require would be so rare, it would almost be like a Christ-like figure for classical musicians. And I don't know if that's even possible. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's unlikely. Unfortunately, I had a conversation with a friend a few months ago, and I was talking to him about some of the topics we're discussing, and he was talking about the fact that no, there are popular artists today who write really sophisticated music that have large audiences, and the idea being that once you get outside of the sort of academic music world, you realize that it is entirely possible to write in a more popular idiom, but still write sophisticated music and have a large audience. And he cited a few examples of this, and he said, "What about this guy?" And he mentioned an act, and he said, "These people are huge superstars. They're unbelievably famous." And he was shocked that I hadn't heard of them. So I went on YouTube and looked up this band, and they had a video that had been viewed 30 million times or something, and it was like. And I was reflecting on this afterwards, and I was thinking, this is actually interesting that, I'm a professional in the field of music, and here's somebody that's got 30 million views on YouTube. You would think that I would have heard of that. It is actually surprising that they would not at all have been on my radar. But then if you think about the scale and the reach of YouTube, which reaches billions of people, and then you think of what 30 million represents relative to the viewership of YouTube, and then if you think of YouTube as only one sort of branch on the tree that is social media, and the fact that there are other platforms that reach huge numbers of people as well, then you realize that 30 million isn't as big as a number as it seems. And that's not to diminish for a second the achievement of reaching 30 million people on YouTube as a musical artist, but simply to say that relative to the potential reach of the platform and the number of people who are on it, it's not as big a slice of the pie as that would have been 40 or 50 years ago. So the fascinating result of that is you can reach 50 million people today and still be a niche taste, relative to the number of people who are listening to music.
Yeah.
So that just makes me think that it's not possible. It's like even the most accessible artist writing the most brilliant music is going to ultimately be a minority taste. Just due to the structure of our listening habits, of the platforms that we hear music on, and the fact that all of these technologies encourage the development of a highly fragmented society in which people spend increasing amounts of time online, but not necessarily physically interacting with each other.
Yeah.
So so you can get these feeds on X or on YouTube or whatever that are completely 100% tailored to your highly idiosyncratic tastes that nobody else shares. And the algorithm will continue to serve you nothing but those things, right? And it's self-perpetuating. So it's like, I don't see how a Bernstein could possibly cut across such a structure. I think it's impossible.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating. And I've always feel a little bit incredulous when I hear music education people in my world talk sometimes about the dominance. They will use terms like dominance and hegemony related to classical music and European classical music in the classroom, as if it's snuffing out Taylor Swift, which, I mean, they don't say that, but but it's such a strange thing, because in a lot of ways, classical music is a tiny sliver of a minority, of a fraction of a percent of people that actually are interested in it, want to play it, want to listen to it. That it seems strange to me to be concerned in any context that classical music is over dominating anything. We are such a niche.
It's simply an inversion of reality. I mean, it's the opposite of the truth. And
right.
This has been the case for a long time, for at least a century. I mean, the popular and commercial music have a vastly greater reach and vastly greater commercial consequences, and consequently, far more people are aware of them than the classical music tradition.
Yeah, I would even go so far as to say that if academics weren't teaching classical music, then it would not exist at all.
I would be hesitant to make that claim, because I think that these things are so foundational. They're so anchored in our culture, whether we're aware of it consciously or not, that I think there would always be some amount of people that would want to play it and that would be interested in listening to it. It would probably be a smaller number, but I don't know if it would be that much smaller necessarily. It's an open question in any case, but I think it would be like saying, if nobody taught Dante, then it would just disappear. It would just collect dust on library shelves, and I don't think that's necessarily the case. Composers like Bach and Beethoven are so utterly foundational to the entire development of music in the Western world that it seems highly implausible to me that repertoire would simply vanish.
Well, then how about I adjust my claim a little bit and see if you like it better? Maybe that it wouldn't cease to exist, but maybe it would become even more niche and even more, ironically, available only to the privileged if it wasn't taught in schools.
Well, it depends on what privilege you're talking about.
Wealth, primarily wealth.
I think there's an even scarcer commodity, which is attention and the ability to focus, and the cultivation of knowledge and historical perspective and an understanding of the repertoire. And that is something that is very, very difficult to achieve, I think, in a society that's completely drowning in noise and distraction all the time. So people who are able to focus and who are able to go deep on things are going to have a huge advantage moving forward, because I think the default will be a kind of constant state of distraction.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. And I appreciate that clarity because these are a lot of times when I'm talking with people about stuff like this, I'm just spitballing on what I notice. I just think that because I'm all for music classrooms being incredibly diverse in terms of styles of music being presented. I just know that most of the kids that I encounter uh, have never heard any kind of music that's not on the algorithmically like as you were talking about before, the algorithmically fed to them Spotify playlist that oftentimes comes straight from popular culture and only from popular culture. And so it's one of the biggest challenges I face as a classroom teacher of music is getting kids to really buy into how great it is for them to become music makers at a high level, almost like selling virtuosity to them is a very, very difficult thing because, of course, they can just go to their phone and press play whenever they want music. So, if it's okay, I would like to take just one more topic, which is
Sure.
virtuosity. Why is it so hard to sell virtuosity these days? Why is it hard to try to define it? And is that, do you see that as something that has changed over the last 100 years since classical music, et cetera, was more ubiquitous?
Well, virtuosity has gotten to be a lot more common than it used to be because the standards of performance have risen dramatically, especially in
Mm,
the last 4 or 5 decades. So a graduate from just about any European music school, a Hochschule in Germany or a conservatory in France, in a piano performance program, for example, is likely going to be technically equipped to play just about anything that Liszt ever wrote. And in the 19th century, the only people who could play Liszt were Liszt himself. I mean,
yeah,
like
that's true. Yeah.
it wasn't accessible to anybody else because his technique was so extravagant and so idiosyncratic and so highly developed, and so novel as well. Like it was developed partly in response to the developments in piano manufacturing that made all of these things possible. But now it's like any anonymous graduate from one of these schools can play the Étude transcendantale of Liszt. They can play the complete works of Chopin. That's just part of their training. So I think that that kind of virtuosity is not as scarce as it was at one point. And consequently, you can find scores of unbelievably skilled pianists who can't make a living, who are finding it very, very difficult to get any sustainable professional life going at all. Like you see people who can play Chopin divinely, right? Who are working as accompanists in third-rate opera houses, um, who are just going to have a very, very difficult time establishing themselves.
Mm.
So I think that the skills that are necessary moving forward for anybody who wants to have a public career in music, I mean, you have to be good at communicating. I mean, it's essential. It used to be that you could kind of get by, provided that you had a strong enough network, a strong enough support network around you, agents and publishers and record labels and all that sort of thing. Even if you were highly eccentric, even if you were terrible at communicating, even if you weren't particularly charismatic, you could mitigate some of those deficiencies to a degree. But I think increasingly the world is going to belong to those who can communicate effectively, and who are good at manipulating social media, and who understand the economy of attention. So, and that will be a component of their virtuosity.
That's absolutely true. So you make sure I'm understanding you correctly. So you would say that it's not that virtuosic players or composers or singers or whatever, it's not that they don't exist or that they exist less. It's that that's not enough anymore.
No, it's not enough anymore. And look, music schools all over the world are churning out hundreds and hundreds of graduates every year who can do extraordinary things. It's the same problem with composition. It's like if you were to sum up all of the doctoral programs in the United States that produce highly trained composers, yeah, how many graduates are there every year, armed with doctoral degrees, that are graduating into a void? And they might be hugely skilled and they might be writing distinctive music, but it's unbelievably difficult for them to keep themselves afloat and to develop an audience.
Yeah.
So I think however, the opportunities and the possibilities that are afforded by technology are now greater than ever, right? So it's more difficult in a sense to get attention, uh, but there are also sort of more means to do so than has ever been the case before. So
Yeah.
I think that I think teachers are going to have to emphasize that a little bit more going forward. In other words, you're going to have to arm your students with actual pragmatic professional skills that reflect the reality of what the music world looks like now. And what I saw when I was a student, incidentally, because I studied in Paris, and I started my studies, my high level studies, about 20, it was over 20 years ago. But at that time, the field was dominated by people who had been born in the 1950s and 1960s, and who had benefited from that sort of post-war boom and all of the funding and all the subsidies that were available for artists at that time. And for them, their career path was relatively straightforward, and there simply weren't as many people doing it. And so they were teaching their students as though that world still existed. And a lot of them sort of assumed that the conditions that had been possible in the 70s and 80s would continue to exist indefinitely. And whereas when I was a student, it was pretty obvious to me that you could see the trajectory very easily. It was not looking good, right? That world was definitely crumbling and falling away and turning into something else. So it's like you can either try to emulate the professional path of somebody who grew up in a totally different world than you, or you can try to figure out what you need to do to survive in a vastly different world.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like I see a possibility where that virtuosity was cultivated in many musicians. They saw that it did not yield the career they were promised, and then a certain cynicism about the art form and the system in which they were raised in the art form, whatever their particular art form uh, is has led to maybe a disbelief in the art form altogether. So, for example, you mentioned people with doctoral degrees flooding into an ecosystem where there isn't enough demand to support their careers. Well, then, of course, they're going to have all kinds of negative feelings about, why did I work so hard to become so amazing at this? If it's not gonna be the job that I was promised to have. Is that kind of what are we talking about the same thing essentially? Do you think?
Well, I think the obvious answer is that the doctoral degree is of no utility whatsoever, and that it's likely that for the vast majority of them, it's a waste of time to pursue it. And not only is it a waste of time, but it's actually counterproductive because it's taking time away from things that might actually be way more interesting and way more productive, and might offer more possibilities.
Yeah.
So the doctoral degree
Unless
thing
you want to be a
is the
professor.
result, unless you want to be well, but even there, like that's very, very unlikely to happen. And
Right.
a lot of prestigious universities are simply shutting down their composition departments anyway, and I think that's likely to continue. So, you could be the one in 10,000 person that gets a really good position somewhere, but it's very unlikely to happen, and I certainly wouldn't count on it as a career plan.
Hmm.
If you look at the composers of the 20th century that had the broadest effect on the culture, it's people like Steve Reich, Philip Glass, Arvo Pärt, Pierre Boulez, Stockhausen. None of them had doctoral degrees. None of them were academics at all. They had some amount of training, but often it was either they were either self-taught or they studied in conservatories, but they weren't academics. And like the figure of the artist who ends up having a large impact on the culture is almost by definition the person that doesn't do the expected thing, that doesn't do the thing that everybody else is doing. And it's like that used to be what we expected from artists, that they would sort of stand outside of things and that they would live unconventionally. I don't know where that's gone. Like I don't know what drives people to go and get doctoral degrees in composition. I find that utterly mystifying. It's a strange way to use your time.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, and this is true for performers as well. It's true for conductors. It's true for composers, as you've already discussed. But sometimes the incentives can be perverted by the promise of these gatekeeping institutions that we talked about earlier in the conversation. It's, oh, is your career stalled out? Well, what you need is the next degree for, and you're gonna, by the way, you're gonna pay $100,000 for it, or
Yeah, yeah.
whatever. And I think in a lot of ways, you also get met with by those gatekeepers with skepticism or even outright anger if you are able to figure out a way to become successful without going through the gate.
Oh,
And
sure.
so so that's a constant conversation slash debate back and forth within all of these musical spheres.
Yeah, well, it's a gingerbread house basically, right? They're trying to lure kids in and and then cook them and eat them. It's horrible. Uh, the other thing is like you can't forget that a lot of these institutions are effectively run as businesses. They need large numbers of students to be viable. It's a gigantic Ponzi scheme in a sense. And of course, one of the results of that is the more graduates you turn out, the more it dilutes the job market. In any case, it's like it becomes less and less likely that anybody's going to be gainfully employed in this manner. So I don't think it's the way to go. Like the again, the artists in the 20th century, John Cage is another example. These are highly idiosyncratic, eccentric people who did not do anything in the standard way. Who invented their own pathway, who were the sort of deeply unusual people that fit in the worst into institutional situations. Like they can't exist in those kinds of places because they're too weird,
Hmm.
right? And that used to be something that was a great strength of the United States, that it would create these sorts of characters that were just utterly original. Um, and now it's become this drive where everybody has to go and get the same doctoral degree from Harvard or Yale or Princeton or whatever. And um, I understand the incentive structure, but if I were in that position, if I were a young composer starting out today, I would really seriously think twice before doing that.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. That's a fantastic way to end our conversation by making all of our academic colleagues mad at us. So I think that's a really good place to a place to stop before we dig our hole any deeper. But my goodness, yes, this has been really, really interesting, Samuel. I really appreciate you spending an hour with me. Do you have a final thought for my music educator audience?
Well, I would end on a hopeful note, which is that there's clearly a structure that's no longer adequate to the way the world works, that is crumbling and that is falling apart, and we can see evidence of that everywhere. So, I don't see this as a hopeless situation by any means. I see that there are extraordinarily powerful new models emerging that I believe could liberate an enormous amount of human potential. We have to remain open to other ways of structuring a career and other ways of reaching audiences. And um, it's easier said than done, obviously, because you're jumping into the unknown, and a lot of these things are still developing rapidly, and who knows what they'll look like in 5 years' time.
Yeah.
But you have to be quick on your feet, and you have to pay attention to what's happening in the culture, and do not by any means assume that the things that worked for people 20 years ago will work for you today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. Thank you so much for joining me. This has been great.
My pleasure. I enjoyed the conversation, and thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of a conversation. If you are still hearing my voice, that means you're one of the MVPs, one of the diehards, one of the real ones, as the kids say. So if you are willing on the way out to check out a few different ways that you can help me continue to make this show high quality. One, use the promo code. That's the biggest one at Sight Reading Factory, at mymusicfolders.com, at mychoirropes.com, at graphitepublishing.com, and endeavormusicpublishing.com. All of those take the Choralosophy checkout code, and of course now the newest one is 3-Minute Theory. You can get a 15% discount when you enter Choralosophy at checkout there. And of course, going to Apple Podcasts and leaving a positive review is very helpful there, and sharing the episodes to your colleagues in real life and on social media. All of those things are incredibly helpful and allow me to continue to create this resource for you. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.